Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour. Welcome to our Pause-Midi talk for the month of April. I'm Eric Trinkus, whom I assume most of you know. We have the pleasure today of having a talk by Hendrik Van Gijseghem from the Musée de la Pointe de Calière in Montreal, the Archaeology and History Museum in Montreal. He's going to talk, as you can see from the title, about the archaeology and history of Canada's first parliament, which, as he will describe, was burned to the ground in 1849. And it's, I have learned, was an important event in a very important period in Canadian history. Two technical points: you have all been muted, and please keep it that way until the end so that we do not get auditory feedback. And if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and we will get to those at the end. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Hendrik.
Bonjour, hello everybody. I would like to do this this talk in English simply for practical reasons, because the PowerPoint, or the base for the PowerPoint that I had, was already in English. But feel free to ask questions in French. I'm bilingual that way. So we're going to talk about this important period in the history of Montreal, in the history of Canada as well, that has been a little bit muted historically up until recently. My museum's been involved in research in archaeology and history about the era surrounding the Parliament, when the Parliament was in Montreal from 1844 to 1849. To sort of like try to tease out a little bit better the impact of that period on Montreal and on the British colony that was Canada at the time. So I'm not going to delve too long into the history of what happened here, but to make a fairly long story short, Lower and Upper Canada, both British colonies, were united in 1841. And the government had to elect a place to be the capital. So they chose Kingston, Ontario, which was a terrible place because there were worries that it wasn't very well developed. The parliamentarians were unhappy. It was close to the US border. And back then, the British colonies were afraid on US encroachment on their territories. So eventually it was moved to Montreal. In what was the largest building at the time, the largest non-religious building at the time, which was a market, Marché Sainte-Anne, which was, large enough to accommodate, the chambers of the Assembly and the Council. So it's an important era. Also, because the circumstances of the fire, the Parliament was burned down in 1849. Again, it's a multi-dimensional series of causes, but by and large, it was factionalism created by progressive policies and conservative ones, which made the Tories were conservatives, largely fairly unhappy, and it was by and large the slow march towards what would eventually become a democracy. So increasing distanciation from the British Crown, increasing autonomy in internal affairs, and so the Tories were very upset about that, unhappy, and for a variety of reasons, on the night of April 25th. 1849, rioted and burned down the Parliament. The capital was moved alternately from Quebec City to Toronto, back to Quebec City, back to Toronto, until settling finally in Ottawa. which was a nowhere place at the time. It was a tiny little outpost called Bytown, and there's something a little bit ironic. It was Queen Victoria herself who said, "Well, capital of Canada is going to be in Bytown." We don't know really what the intentions were, but since then, it was like in the history of Montreal, it was perceived as a failure, right? It's something a little bit shameful. But since 2010, the museum, with its collaborators, have undergone a lot of research to really reestablish the importance of that time period in Montreal. So we are in what was then the western part of Montreal, which is now the western part of Old Montreal. And the one thing to know, the most important thing to know to understand the archaeology of this place is that prior to 1830, crossing through Old Montreal, a river that drains the island of Montreal. Various streams converge, and it was called the Petite Rivière, so the little river. And it had become, with increasing population, increasing wastewater runoff, it had become really insalubre, unhealthy, unhygienic, and there had been epidemics of typhus and other things at the time. So it was known, back then, the theory of miasmas, that bad smells carried diseases, and so it was decided to cover the river over. And the city then found itself with a lot of extra space right in the middle of its territory. And so it was decided to, in order to supply in food the rapidly growing faubourg in the western part of the city, to use that space, or part of that space, to build the Marché Saint-Anne, the Saint Anne's Market, which would eventually become the parliament after 1844, or it would house the parliament in 1844. So this is Saint Anne's Market. It was built in a single architectural program, and it's very interesting, and it was very sort of innovative at the time, in the sense that down here, I don't know if you see my cursor, is the first sewer collector, which is basically the river covered over underneath the building. And so because the building was built in the riverbed, its foundations extend very, very deeply, all the way to what was the bottom of what was once the riverbed. So the foundations from street level today are about 5 meters or 15 feet down. And this is important to understand the particularly good preservation of the archaeological contexts. Above the sewer, or above the channeled river, were sort of like semi-basement cellars, which were rented by the market by the month. And we don't know much about what was in there or what was being sold, but what's important to realize is that from those cellars, people sold a bunch of wares. There's probably a bar somewhere, or a little canteen or something like that. And through these wooden floors, we have figured out that people in those cellars were getting rid of their trash, which then accumulated underneath the floors in a space about 6 feet tall, all the way down to the bottom of the river. And this is also important to figure out, to understand the archaeological context. So we have an archaeological sort of cross sections here, with the former bottom of the river, the former river banks, and the ways in which the foundations of the building were sunk all the way down into the riverbed, leaving a lot of empty space on each part of the sewer collector. Now, this sewer collector was built in 1832, between 1832 and 1834, And it wasn't used until, and I'm not misspeaking, it was used until 1989. So it was pristine construction made of like really, really hard, tough masonry. So it was in use until 1989, sorry. So 1989, when so it had the effect of, because it was running all the way through the site, it had the effect of more or less protecting the site from sort of savage urban developments that was going on at the time in other parts of the city, where people were sinking basements and all sorts of things, and public services and things like that, without much regard for archaeological heritage, because archaeology did not exist back then. But in 1989, there was, as soon as the sewer was discommissioned, there was already a project to build an underground parking lot on this space. And that's when city officials and historians and archaeologists were thinking, hey, isn't that where, the old parliament was? Because there was no commemoration, there was no plaque or anything like that, which speaks to the fact that, it has been considered sort of a shameful heritage. So with the development of archaeology and heritage concerns, studies started to be made, and archaeological test pits were sunk there, and it was revealed that it was potentially a really important archaeological site. So the project of the underground parking lot was voted on, and it was blocked 3-2 at the city council. So there was almost complete destruction of that era. This is the collector underneath the building. It's still in pristine shape, and if you come to the museum, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, if you come to the museum, you can walk through it, through a large portion of it, and which may be a portion of which may be further developed in the future. So it's a fantastic construction. At the same time, in London and Paris and other places, these kinds of constructions were made out of brick because they were a lot more expedient and cheaper to make. And this one was made out of stone, and we don't really understand why, because it requires so much more resources, and they're not little stones. They're very, a meter across, 3 feet across. But it's a fairly impressive work of civic engineering. So we undertook in 2010 a series of excavations on this site. This is a boring, archaeological excavation plan, but just to highlight the fact that the collector runs in the middle over here, and we've excavated on each side a significant portion of the site, but we left one large area, one of the wings, completely untouched, just out of concerns for preservation. And, as a principle, we don't dig sites entirely. We leave some portions of them for future generations of archaeologists who may have different concerns, different methods, and things like that. So, but they are still significant excavations at the time. The last campaign was 2017, and it was the largest urban excavation site in the country, and maybe in North America at the time. It was really significant. Employing about 20 archaeologists for 4 months during the summer of 2017. The excavations, the various years of excavations yielded about 315,000 artifacts. But when I say artifacts, I don't mean entire objects. I mean 315,000 fragments dating from both the time of the market, 32 to 44, and the time of the parliament from 44 to 49, and another market which would eventually be built on top of the remains of the parliament, which was then destroyed in 1901. So it's a significant collection. It belongs to the city of Montreal, but the museum has curatorship for now to study it and do some conservation work on the collection. So because of the setting of the site and the foundations that run really deep because of the presence of the sewer there, we have a very neat sort of stratigraphy over a very large area, because again, it was undisturbed. Its depth made it largely undisturbed by urban developments, and the depth made it so that the various strata of archaeological remains sort of remained on top of one another. So we have the natural bed of the little river, on top of which the collector sewer and the market were constructed, and then tons of garbage were thrown into the basements below the cellars. The building was occupied by the Parliament from 1844 to 1849 and underwent significant renovations and modifications that we're just beginning to understand, because we have basically no iconography or descriptions of the Parliament. So a lot of what we're running on are archival work, contracts for renovations and things like that. After 1841, what we call the third market, because the second market was elsewhere, and the third market was constructed, then the remains of that were thrown on top of the first market and Parliament's remains. So it's a very, very well stratified site over this depth of about 15 feet. And the modern surface remained basically vacant from 1901 until 1989, when there was that project of underground parking lot. So we've undergone this sort of work with a 3D artist also to sort of reconstruct to the best of our knowledge what each of these different occupations of the building would have looked like. So we have some views of the cellars at the time of the market, with what we understand to be traps in the floor, like I mentioned, where garbage would go and accumulate underneath in the basement, or kind of like crawl space type deal, which was probably very unpleasant kind of spaces. They weren't occupied; they were really just for rubbish. And so we've been working on this with this 3D artist, who's also an architect, which is really useful for us because he can tell us what's possible and what's not. Again, we don't have any iconography, so we don't know where the stairs are exactly, except for some vague descriptions of someone saying things like, I went down the hall and then went upstairs to, so which hall, which upstairs. So this 3D artist, from his architectural point of view, can sort of help us like tease out what's possible. And I think we've achieved a pretty good understanding of both the market and how it was renovated into the Parliament, with the Legislative Assembly chamber on top, because the market had these large rooms on top that were rented out for various political rallies, musical concerts, and things like that. And so these large rooms were used to house the debates of both the Assembly and the Legislative Council. It doesn't look that sexy archaeologically, but it's just to highlight the fact that you have to go through a lot of rubble from destruction of the third market and destruction of the Parliament, because the Parliament, after it burned down, was left more or less untouched for about 1.5 to 2 years, and eventually destroyed. And so the rubble, or part of the rubble, was just thrown on top of the remains. But this kind of a red stratum there is part of the burned remains of the Parliament, which they themselves lie on top of the non-burned remains of the garbage from the market. And so this is how this kind of explains why the remains were so well preserved, because they were they fell, at different time periods in very, very deep empty spaces that were the crawl spaces under the cellars of the market. And then, of course, when the parliament burned down, it burned down in minutes. So everything was left behind. There were no casualties. Everybody fled, but they left behind, what was inside the parliament. Now we understand that in the interim, after it burned down, there was quite a bit of cleaning, let's call it that. We don't know in what circumstances, but some things were salvaged after the fire. We know, for instance, that there were wood stoves to heat the parliament. We haven't found any, not there. There was like a few dozen wood stoves, and we found precisely none archaeologically. So there were probably some salvaging of metals and things like that, possibly other things as well. So we don't have 100% of the material culture of the parliament because some things were recuperated, but we do have a really good cross section of the things that people didn't want to salvage. And a fire is really good for archaeologists. And this is from the Montreal Gazette after we spoke to the media in 2017. And I think I'm responsible for this because I said something to the effect that, fires are disastrous for people at the time, but for archaeologists, they're great because everything's left behind. Everything is in primary context. In some cases, so they had this caricature show up saying based on a wood print from that time that they modified to say that it was a great opportunity for future archaeologists, which I agree with. Really, really quick look at the kinds of things that we're finding both in the market and the parliament. Basically, we're finding complete objects. At the time of the market, things were broken down and they were discarded. They were broken, but they were still complete. So by and large, and we don't necessarily have the complete objects. We don't necessarily have all the fragments. This is urban historical archaeology is quick, and we accept the fact that some things are not going to be collected, but by and large, we have complete objects from the market because things broke down and were thrown out, and from the parliament, of course, because things burned down and they ended up at the very same place at the bottom of what was once a little riverbed. Very, very fire altered materials, of course, from the time of the parliament. Really quick look at the things that we're finding: smoking pipes, glasses before and after restoration, some items of political propaganda. These are a couple of pictures that they're this kind of object was often used. I liken them to baseball cards today. You have these objects because you're a fan of what they represent, and this is the British Prime Minister Peel and Richard Cobden on the other side, and they were together responsible for some of the reforms that made the Tories so angry. In this case, the repeal of the Corn Laws to help Ireland during the famine there. So basically, repealing the preferential tariffs that large landowners had. And so they're known for that, for their alliance. Cobden and Peel is known for having repealed the Corn Laws. So whoever owned these, whatever politician in the parliament owned these objects, was clearly progressive and a fan of the progressive measures that the government was going on at the time, and maybe even using those to pour drinks to Tory adversaries or something like that. We found toilets, which we really didn't know even existed at the time. They were cutting edge self-flushing water closets, and so very famous people in the history of Canadian politics probably used those. We found a couple of those, five in all, I believe. And then in 2013, I dug at the site in 2011, which was a very, very dry summer. And I remember seeing some things kind of fly into the air when we were digging through the levels of the parliament, the burned levels. And they went back in 2013, which was a very wet year, very rainy. And so the soils had a very different texture. And it was established, it was noticed that these things that were flying out into the air and like little burned fragments were in fact remains of written materials. They were remains of books. And so we since then found about 70 of these clumps of carbonized paper, which is highly unusual in archaeology. Even in historical archaeology in recent times, these things don't preserve. But in this case, they preserved, probably because, well, of course, they were carbonized, they were completely burned. And if you've ever tried to, burn a book, they don't burn very well. They just clump because the air doesn't circulate between the pages. That seems to have happened here. And then they were deposited with the rest of the remains of the parliament very deep underground, probably in a waterlogged state much of the year, and certainly deep enough to avoid the cycles of thawing frost. And so for this reason, they were by and large fairly well preserved, enough that we can like detect some reading and then just dump that stuff in Google Books and identify the books that they had. Now this is almost, we found two concentrations of these books, and they seem to represent, or they do represent, the locations of both libraries that were in the parliament, the Library of the Assembly and the Library of the council. And so with our artist, we tried to imagine what these would look like. So we're currently involved in the process of detecting some writing and identifying what kind of books that we have. We would like to find something shocking, but as in part in terms of literature at the time, but we haven't. That they're mostly the political treatises and things like that, and testifying to the power and potency of the fire. Basically, everything that's made out of glass has melted. So we do find lots and tons of melted glass bottles, window glass, and things like that. This is a fun little object that we found. It's a traveling inkwell, the one on the right, and we found identical item on eBay. So we bought this one for comparison, but you can see that the glass base is absolutely completely melted by the fires, which again testifies to the heat that was generated at the time. At the time before the context of the parliament, we find a lot of things that you'd expect from literate society and offices and things like that. Lots of ink bottles of all sorts. We found a postmark stamp, essentially, where written Legislative Assembly Canada, and we found that, and it's an odd object. We don't really know about much of this, like the office supplies at the time. And so when we found it, I just jumped on Google to see if there were others, basically like in private collections or antique store, and I didn't find any. But what I did find was a letter that was stamped, probably by that very postmark, a week before the fire in 1849. So that was found it was found again on eBay, and so we bought it. And so there was something almost poetic in reuniting the stamp and the envelope that was it was stamped with in 1849, a week before the fire, from an MP called Cameron, who's writing to a banister in London, Ontario, saying things like, all our great measures will pass and Parliament will sit till June. And that was not to be, because a week later it would burn down. I also found another fun little object, the Library of Council wax seal that was probably stamping some documents from that library. This was not found archaeologically, but there's a fun story behind it. The first archaeological campaign in 2010 had the interest of some journalists across the country, and the Toronto Globe and Mail ran a story on Montreal's excavations in the old Parliament and things like that. And the museum, that was before my time, I wasn't here then, but the museum got a call from a former general solicitor of Canada under the Trudeau, the elder Trudeau government, who lived between Toronto and New York, and when he was, traveling from Toronto to New York, liked to stop in antique stores in upstate New York and other places, and came across this object, and the guy selling it was like, yeah, my family says that that it was salvaged from the Parliament that burned down in Montreal. An interesting story. That person, Robert Kaplan, didn't know if he believed it or not, but thought it was an interesting object, and so bought it and hung it in New York City above his piano. That's how the story goes. When he read the story in 2010 from the Globe and Mail, he contacted the museum and told the story and said, would you like this object? We'd like to, I could donate it to the museum. So we said, yeah. And we had it analyzed, we had it restored and analyzed, and it's probably based on the coats of paints and the technologies used to generate some of these paints. It was probably something that was produced in the 1830s, which chronologically makes a lot of sense if it was that object right here, which is one of the only iconographies that we have of the inside of the Parliament. This is chamber of the Assembly, and above the throne of the Speaker seems to be the scale is right, the colors are right, the coat of arms of the British Empire at the time. So it may be the object that was donated to us. Now, if I go back, you'll notice that the lion is on the left over here, but the lion is on the right on the painting, which is a mistake because that's not how the British coat of arms is. And we're thinking that we don't know why the painter did it that way, but it might have been because he's Scottish, and that's the right that is the correct orientation for the Scottish coat of arms. So that may have been a little jab at the British Empire. We're just not sure, but it's possible that this is the object that we have in our possession. So since then, we've been involved in a very large, it's been 7 years now since the last campaign of excavations, but we're still very much involved in trying to understand that collection, do works of restoration and conservation, and further analyses and uncovering new things. So we don't have unlimited resources, but whenever we can, we surround ourselves with good professionals who can help us with that stuff. Interesting things are happening in that, on the left, you have a plate that was partially restored as a result of one campaign of excavation. And then on the right, you have the missing fragments that come from later campaigns of excavations. So again, testifying that all those objects are really complete. We have different techniques to study this material. The burned remains sometimes hide completely the decorations or what kind of motif is on ceramics. The use of ultraviolet light may reveal some. You can see a little feminine shape there. So we're just like continuing and studying this entire collection. UV rays to study glass. I just included this slide because I think it's just so gorgeous. But also to point out that we're surrounding ourselves with like new materials also to better understand this this collection. This is the mystery object. We don't know what it is. Eric saw it on his visit in Montreal. It's made out of steel and tin or iron tin, and using X-rays, it's revealed that the inside is completely composed of little honeycomb shapes into each one has a little metal pin. It looks very technologically advanced for 1849, and we don't know what it is. We had a bunch of hypotheses like battery or some kind of apparatus for computing or things like that. So, but this is our mystery object. We still don't know what it is. You can see fragments of there are 3 of them altogether. One of them is intact. The other ones are broken, which allows us to see inside as well. So that's a mystery to us. Colleagues and I started noticing, however, through this reanalysis of the collection, that there were things that were anomalous for the for when it comes to a parliament. This is part of a nice porcelain breakfast set, but MPs were not in the building in the mornings. They were sitting at night, and you know, we were like, well, maybe, you know, one had a breakfast set in his office. We don't know, and you know, dismissed it for a while, and then a lot of other stuff started showing up that were considered increasingly anomalous. Things related to dinnerwares and this breakfast set, a little tea set that is made for a child, lots of things related to hygiene, even cooking and things like that, which you know, in our understanding, didn't really belong in an office building, which basically the parliament was. Now in 2013, because we're a museum, we tend to need to communicate information quickly. It was concluded a little bit hastily that this was the remains of the restaurant of the parliament. And that's until historians said, well, there's no evidence that there was a restaurant at the parliament, and there really shouldn't be a restaurant at the parliament. So we had to review that hypothesis. Now we knew that from archives that there was at least one person living in the parliament. He was a chief messenger called Cardinal. It was a chief messenger, which is roughly the equivalent of honorary position as a caretaker of sorts. So he lived there year round and probably took care of the building. But we didn't know much about that. If he had a family, or, you know, we had to like do a little bit more research in that. And we were convinced that we had all these anomalous sort of contents were actually all part of Cardinal's household assemblage. And so we made a case and published that in a couple of places, and you know, had a little bit of resistance because some colleagues were like, well, you know, it could be anything. You don't have any kind of proof that it's like their apartment or that it's a complete household. We now know that he was living there with his wife, his kid, a domestic servant, and her little sister. So it's a household of 5 people. And we knew that somewhere there was a list of the possessions that they had lost in the fire, because the the reclamations, he wanted to get like some some payment for his loss, for his losses, and this document is referred to here and there, but we never found it until my colleague Francois came across the list in question, with a very detailed, room by room, and valued object by object, things that they lost in the fire. Now, a lot of these things we didn't find because they're clothing, or they're like curtains or rugs and things like that. But everything that is earthenware and ceramic, well, these are some of the examples of the things that he had. It's interesting to imagine the 19th century household. This is the stuff he had, including two canaries and two goldfish, which we did not find, but the fire was pretty intense. But he does mention that he has a dinner service, dinnerware, and a breakfast service, and the breakfast service is described as being much, much more valuable than the dinner service, and we know why. He doesn't say why, but we know why. It's because it's porcelain. It's bone china porcelain, and so this was as close as of an archaeological smoking gun, in our view, that you could get in confirming that what we had found and already published was in fact the apartment of that family. And even he mentioned that he has a bénitier, or like holy water stoup, and we found that, and on the back of it is a faint writing, which initially we thought it was an S-E-R. You can kind of see that, but when comparing to some versions of his signature, it looks likely that in the back of that holy water stoup was in fact the name of Leroux Cardinal, the chief messenger of the assembly. So these are the excavations and the ongoing analyses that have kept us occupied, among other things, for the past few years. We've developed with Université du Québec à Montréal a sort of like georeferenced tool to sort of explore the distribution, the stratigraphic and spatial distribution of different kinds of objects, or different kinds of objects that serve different kinds of functions, to sort of tease out or explore or answer explore some hypotheses. And this is also ongoing. We still use it very much. We had a little 3D series of models as well that we've had fun developing. And so this building, or these remains, are close to the museum, 2 blocks away. This is the site of the museum, or the complex of the museum, with the walkable portion of the collector sewer, which eventually we have a project to extend that towards the remains of the market and parliament, and then showcase those as well. But it's a gigantic project, very, very expensive. So we're working towards that. We'll see if it happens. So this is the portion of the collector that is showcased currently at the museum, the section built between 1834 and 1838. So the eastward extension of the collector, but that eventually leads all the way to the remains of the parliament. So that's the project that we're strategizing toward. To have the remains and the collection showcased in a new building, making the Pointe-à-Carrière archaeological complex significantly larger. And everything that I've touched upon and much more is consigned in a publication, a collective publication that we made in 2022, available in both French and English on the site of the museum. And it's a collective with several archaeologists and historians talking about really different aspects of the time period preceding and following the time between 1844 and 1849. How am I doing on time? Pretty good.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And if you can get us out of the share screen, we can pull up the chat.
Sure.
And to see if there don't seem to be any questions right now. Are there questions out there? You covered a lot of material. Thank you. And it's and having done a fair amount of archaeology myself, I can say that the job of not just excavating the material and sorting it out, trying out through stratigraphy, but sorting through and putting all of that material together it takes a long time, and it's the kind of stuff you just keep coming back to again and again. Anyway, it's an enormous amount of work, and I appreciate it, and I hope other people do that as well. Okay,
I think there's yep.
Can you see the chat and the?
I can.
Okay, the one I'll just let you follow.
Yeah, the first question is I don't know in what order they were here, but I'll read them from top to bottom. What was the language of the 1840s Parliament? English or French or both? Actually, very, very good question, because it is not a stranger to the explosive situation that was going on at the time. The British Empire was in a mode of compromise. It wanted its existence to be widely accepted by the population, so it was softening its politics. And one of the many compromises, was that French in Montreal in 1844 was accepted as one of the official languages of Parliament. Not a huge deal, but one of the little things that made the Anglophone Tory conservatives angry, among many, many other things. So starting in 1844, French, as well as the English, was accepted as an official language of Parliament. Walking through the new collector passage is quite an experience. Vaut la visite. Thank you.
That's from Kim.
Yeah, I need clarification about the use of the collector. Was it ever filled by the river? Yes, absolutely. It was basically a channel. There had already been some channeling work down, but that was extended and made instead out of wood, out of masonry, and the whole thing was covered over. So the whole project was really to contain the river and have it flow underground. So if you know Montreal, just west of the Parliament at McGill Street, the river would still have been just an open air river, and then engulfed itself into the tunnel to eventually flow out into the St. Lawrence. So yeah, it was meant to entirely contain the river. What happened to the river, and why was a sewer built and not used? It was used until 1989 to contain the river. So initially it was not a sewer per se, it was just an underground river, but very quickly secondary sort of sewer systems came and plugged themselves in. So then it became really a sewer and not really not only a channel for the river to flow underground. So we call it the collector, but initially it wasn't a collector sewer, it was just an underground river. We don't know exactly when they started plugging in secondary wastewater runoff, but it looks like it was pretty quickly. There's still water in it. And if you come to the museum, you see that, it's not for to look pretty that there's some water running at the end of the collector. That the water always finds a way, even though today it's pumped into more modern sort of like evacuation systems. There's still water finding its way into the former channel. About how many butchers, fishmongers, vegetable sellers would have been active at the time of the fire? None, actually, because the market was had been moved away into temporary wooden stalls, so it was not as lavish as the former market, which was like a fairly beautiful building. But when Parliament moved in, the stalls were turned into offices. And were cleaned up, of course, but the stalls themselves were turned into little offices, and the market themselves moved just down the street, basically in a temporary market made out of wood, probably to the displeasure of the market sellers and the butchers. Do you have any way to estimate how many people relied on the market for food? I do, but I don't have that answer off the top of my head, but it was one of three large food markets in Montreal at the time, and it was probably supplying the whole western wards of the city, so several, at least a couple of thousand people.
Okay. Could you, I'll just do it orally without writing it. Could you talk that when we visited, you took us over the what remains of the site. Could you talk a little bit about what is there now and what are the plans for turning it into an open air archaeo museum or
yeah. Yeah, that's the project that we're working on to re-excavate because it's backfilled now, and it looks like a park because there's grass, but it can't be a park. It's used as a park by residents, but it can't be a park. It can't be officially a park because there is contamination in the soil. It's not bad, but it's still considered contaminated. So you can't have, like children playing and things like that. So it can't currently be a park, and it's contaminated by archaeological soils. So the things that were burned down and destroyed from the various market occupations, the tar paper on the roof, lead from the windows and things like that. So there's a level of contamination. The problem with that is that the city, which owns this plot, does not want us to excavate anymore, which is fine. But in order to decontaminate this area, you would have to excavate. So it's kind of a catch-22. The city would prefer to have a park there, but they can't really. They'd have to elevate the land about a meter to keep the contamination, below and safe elevation. The residents enjoy that vacant space, and also the people who work in Old Montreal. There is a lack of green space in Old Montreal because it was from the get-go very densely built, and these patrimonial buildings are not being torn down like other things in other parts of. So I understand, the residents to want to maintain this in a vacant space, but the museum's intention is really to work towards this this project of having a new museum building on top of the remains of the foundations of the Parliament, and then use that space within the foundations to showcase the collection and have this a series of exhibits on the collections, on the history, but also on the history of democracy in Canada, which I hadn't really had time to elaborate on. But what we're seeing happening, this catharsis that is the fire of the parliament, is really, I see that as one of the growing pains of a modern liberal state, that Canada, the colony of Canada, went through between, say, the Union in 1841 and the Confederation in 1867.
Yeah. I might point out that Henry gave us a copy of the book, which he illustrated with a slide, and I've been reading through it, and like so many Americans, it really came home to me how little of Canadian history I knew, and still how little of it I know. And I would recommend, if you want to learn something about what was going on in the early middle of 19th century in Canada, and what he's talking about, the building of a liberal democracy. There's a long section in there which is not archaeological; it's strictly historical, which is extremely revealing, and I found it absolutely fascinating.
And a lot of people don't know that you had basically three political attitudes in that time period: a progressive one, leading towards a autonomous republic, eventually a call it conservative or royalist one, which wanted to really to remain a full-fledged colony of the British Empire. And a lot of politicians, a significant number of MPs and other people in civil society were annextionists, thinking that the best way to go would be to get annexed to the US. So Lower and Upper Canada would now be US states, if that, and a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that that was a real serious political project that some MPs were defending at the time, or championing at the time.
Ironically, people talk half seriously about Vermont becoming part of Canada and leaving the
we'll have you. I like Vermont.
By the way. Yeah. Okay. Are there any more questions? Any comments? Any thoughts? Having had a wonderful tour by Hendrik, Kim and I went there a couple of weeks ago. But even without that, I would strongly recommend it. It's a fascinating story. And
thanks so much.
Yes, and thank you very much for your time and enlightenment on all of this. And
thank you, it's much appreciated. Thank you for your attention and interest.
Yeah. Okay.
Merci.